Hello, lovely people. Today I thought I would wrap up everything I read for non-fiction November.
Sophie vlogs.
Non-fiction November is one of my favourite times of the year. I always have the best time taking part. That was no exception this year. Just before I dive into the books, I'm just going to say I had COVID very recently, so if I look a bit rough, it's because I am still recovering. So, Nonfiction November is a reading initiative that is run by Olive over at Book Olive. Every year, the idea is just to read a bit more nonfiction than you normally would. I usually read about 30%, about a third of my reading is usually nonfiction, which I'm very happy with. However, this year I flipped it, and so 60% of my reading in November was nonfiction, and 30% of it, or two-thirds was nonfiction, one-third was fiction. And I'm really happy with that. That was really nice. I really like using the prompts that Olive provides. They always get me thinking of interesting things. I did not read all of the books that I talked about in my TBR video, but I think I did a very healthy showing. I thought I would just go through by the prompts because I thought that was quite a nice way to organise it. So the first prompt, and the one that I started with, was element, and I went for two books that tap into different elements. So the first book I read, I was tapping into like the element of fire, and that is Small Fires, an Epic in the Kitchen by Rebecca May Johnson. This was such an interesting little read. This is food writing, but it very much is unlike any food writing I've really read before. It's really examining like our idea of food writing and also a lot of our attitudes towards food and cooking and that kind of thing. The way that the concept of recipes is discussed is one that's really going to stay with me. Rebecca May Johnson sort of points out this way that you have like a lot on like especially reality cooking programs and that kind of thing. People who talk about recipes in this really damning way, like, oh, I never follow recipes, I always freestyle it. And that's like something that crops up quite a lot in cooking, in talking about food. This idea of recipes as constriction, and recipes and like the true creativity comes when you break away from them. Whereas there's a whole chapter in this where the author is repeating the same recipe time and time and time again, and it's different every time because sometimes they have certain ingredients and sometimes they don't, and that kind of thing. So the recipe is a living being that you engage with. It reminded me a bit of that concept of is it Death of the Author? I can't remember. I did it in critical theory at uni, where it's like a text is not a finished product because it needs a reader, and it's only something that is in process when it is actively being read and engaged with. And it kind of made me think about that, like a recipe. The purpose of a recipe is to give you guidance, and it's something to be interacted with. It's something that is living and breathing when you cook from it, and that kind of thing. That's just one of the chapters. There are loads of different thoughts in this, and I found it really beautifully written. Really, there is like a poeticism to the way that it's written. Very small, like not a big read at all, but one that I definitely think I want to return to and do a reread of in a bit, because as I was reading it, I was enjoying it, but then I've spent the whole month afterwards just thinking about it. So definitely like a really, from my reading experience, like a really innovative, a really fresh way of like approaching food writing, and definitely one that has really sparked off some thoughts and ideas. I could probably babble about lots more chapters in it, but I don't want to like ruin the magic for anyone else who wants to check it out. But I definitely, this was a good way to start the month. The other book I have tapping into element was The Element of Water, and so I went for the Seaweed Collector's Handbook by Miek Zwamborn. This was another one that I love. This was like a 5-star read. I absolutely adored this. I'm now obsessed with seaweed, along with fungi and all of the other things that reading nature writing has got me interested in. I should say as well that this is not just like beautifully written, but the way that this book is put together is just like a piece of art. It first of all, it feels lovely. It's a lovely book to hold. It has a nice weight to it. The paper quality is lovely. It has loads of supporting images throughout, depending on what the topic in question is. It has like not just drawings, photographs, stuff like this. It has beautiful, like it has elements of poetry in it. Just everything to do with seaweed that you could possibly want to learn about is in this. Seaweed as like food, seaweed as something that you eat, seaweed as like scientific, like what are scientists doing, what forms can seaweed take in like scientific research and that kind of thing. Seaweed as art, people who are using it as inspiration for fashion, people who are using seaweed itself to create art. Seaweed as inspiration for paintings, and seaweed as industry throughout history. Like anything you would want to know about seaweed is probably touched on in this book. I just thought that this was wonderful, exquisitely put together, absolutely delightful. I found the writing itself like really engaging. It has a really nice mix of like giving you the information, but I really felt the presence of the author throughout it as well. And I really felt like I could understand why they were drawn to seaweed and the enthusiasm and passion that they had. I just feel like this touched on so many interesting things. I am in the process of trying to find myself some skincare that uses seaweed because apparently that's where my brain is going, and also maybe some statement earrings that are seaweed. I'm wearing my tiny little Athena owls today, but I think it would be cool to have some seaweed earrings. But yeah, this was another one, like, started off the month so strong. Its prompt was record, which I went down sort of like a recording of your life route. And for that, I read Remembering Shanghai, a memoir of socialites, scholars, and scoundrels by Isabel Sun Chao and Clare Chao. Isabel Sun Chao grew up in Shanghai, and her family had a very interesting life. This is very much like a sort of potted history of her family. She goes back through different generations. It also has, this is another book that's like put together really lovely. So it has these little insert bits which always have these like borders which sort of explain a concept to you. This definitely is a book that feels like it's being written for like a Western audience in that regard, because you do have these little like intersections which explain like different concepts, like, oh, what does this word mean, what is this, how is this thing culturally relevant, like what is this food like, that kind of thing. And the way that it's written is interesting because text that is just standard text, I'm trying to find an example and I'm failing. Text that is written just normally is Isabel telling you the tale, and then text that is in italics is Clare, who is sort of, Isabel is giving you her actual remembrances of her life and of these events, and then Clare has sort of done a lot of research since that is looking into stuff that like Isabel didn't know, and then Claire's giving you like a lot of like backstory kind of info on that, which is really interesting. The life of this family certainly makes a much better tale than my family's life would, and also how their father even became powerful and wealthy in the first place. Like that is like a super interesting tale, like a lot of scandal, a lot of fun. Like that was very enjoyable to read about as a story. This does touch on, for example, the experiences during the Second World War, and then Mao's rise to power. Isabel didn't realize, but when she was sent to live with her mother when she was, I think, about 16 or something like that. Essentially, she would never return, and she would never see some of her family members again because they were trying to get her away from this rising influence of Mao's power and all of that. So there's definitely like a lot of like emotional moments and that kind of thing. I will say one thing I felt about this book is that all of the stuff to do with her family was like super engaging, like really told with, you know, like a lot of emotion and that kind of thing. The sort of backstory of this more like wider political events and that kind of thing did not super feel like it was that engaged with. And I think Isabel like says at one point, like she's just like she's not interested in politics, which is fine, but like her family were in a very like unique position where the reason that they were being targeted during Mao's rise to power was because they were rich landholders, and they were literally like the class that were being denounced. And that is a very unique position to be reading the perspective of, but it's also not a position that's super engaged with. And I don't know, it felt a bit like there was like a bit of a disconnect when it came to all of that side of it. I would also say as well, like her class very much comes across in this, because during all of the discussion of her childhood, she talks about different servants who helped raise her, and she talks with great fondness about them, and you get them named, and you like, they are people who are present in this narrative. I have no idea what happened to them. She never tells you if they were okay. Like, she talks a lot about the loss of her father's art collection that he built up and how that seemed to very emotionally hit her, which is like, I get it. But I just find it weird that we spent a lot more time being like, oh, the art collection. And I'm like, what about these people who were like vital in your upbringing? That like, who, are they okay? Were they okay? Are they fine? Like, I don't know. So one I enjoyed for sure, and if you a very like engaging memoir, a very easy to read memoir for sure. Just like at the edges, I was like, I don't care about the art collection as much as I care about whether these lovely people who helped raise you were okay. I don't know, bit weird. Just at the edges. After that is border, and I sort of looked at like borders of countries for that. So the first one I read for that was Neighbours from Hell: English Attitudes to the Welsh by Mike Parker. Mike Parker is English, but he lives in Wales. And this was very interesting. This was not super new concepts to me because I have read quite a lot of literature about Wales now and about Welsh identity and Welsh history, I feel. But I feel like this is very like succinctly put, with told with like elements of humor. But also one thing I think is so effective about this is it just shows you like how depressingly unoriginal a lot of the negative English attitudes to Wales are. Like these jokes about oh, Wales doesn't have any vowels. Like, I'm sorry, it has two more vowels in the English language. What more do you want? Or like jokes about Welsh identities and attitudes and that kind of thing. Like he quotes things from hundreds of years ago. He quotes things from like medieval era. He quotes things from like Georgian era, like Victorian era. Like there are so many quotations, and also lots of one thing I really liked was lots of like archived old cartoons from like old print and that kind of thing, like Victorian satirical cartoons, stuff like this, which just highlights how unoriginal and uninspired these jokes that people still say are. Like it's literally hundreds and hundreds of years of making the same like sheep shagger joke. Like, can we move on now, please, lads? Like, get with it. So yeah, this was very interesting. It's sort of written with the idea of like being written for English people who might be interested in living in Wales. Like maybe it would help you understand some of these attitudes and like why that might rile people up or ruffle feathers before you decide to move there and that kind of thing. So very interesting little read for sure. The other one for border that I read was In the House of the Interpreter, which is a memoir by Anuiwa Thiong'o. I read my first Anuiwa Thiong'o book October, I believe. I talked about it, first book, in the October wrap-up. When was it? September. I think it might have been September. One of them. I'll link it down below. I loved it. I thought it was fantastic. It was a 5-star read for me. It was just a brilliant read. And I wanted to read more about his life. One thing I will say, I did not realize that this is like in the vein of like Maya Angelou's autobiographies, where it's part of a series. So there is one before this, which is when he is a child. I don't think you have to have read that to read this, because I haven't, and I still got a lot out of reading this. I'm just mentioning it like, if you're interested, don't make my mistake. This was the only one in the bookshop when I was there. I didn't realize there were more. He references some things from that, but provides context. So if you haven't read that, it's fine. And I really appreciated that. This is the time during the early 50s, I should have said. Anuiwa Thiong'o is a very famous Kenyan writer. This is during the early 50s when he went to this school called an Alliance School. It was one of the first opportunities for Black Kenyans to be educated in the same way that white Kenyans would have been. And it involved like he travelled to Nairobi to go there. And this is sort of like the period of his life when he starts the school, and then it ends a little bit after he graduates, because it sort of culminates. This isn't a spoiler because it is on the back, and it very much is what you're culminating towards. It culminates in this instance of him being targeted by the police and being imprisoned, and then having a court case, which I believe is very much foreshadowing a lot of things to come in his life, because he actually lived in exile from Kenya for a while. One thing that was very interesting reading this with that in mind is the way that you sort of see it building, because you get to see other people's interactions with the police that he is sort of shielded from by nature of his participation in the Alliance School kind of sets him slightly apart and gives him this like special privilege almost, so that he can see things happening to other people, but his uniform very much protects him until such a point as it does not. But also the way that like he what he gains from going to the Alliance School is very much, you get to see his interest in debate and how that grows, and the debate society, which is very much something that then is so helpful to him when he is in this courtroom situation. It is very interesting to sort of read something where you can see, even although he is writing this as an adult and he will be bringing his adult sensibilities to writing it, you can see the ways in which, even as a child at this school, it is so clear the ways in which discrimination is present in this society, and the way that like colonialism has this impact. And I've not really read a lot about Kenyan history. It's an area that I've been trying to learn more about as a result of reading his work. So this was a really interesting, like, personal account way of putting a lot of that more like abstract political concepts into like a real lived experience. I definitely would be interested in reading like the whole memoir series. It did remind me a lot of Maya Angelou's autobiography series in the way that I can see how, as a whole, this series will chart us across his life. Each book, there are like, these are the topics we're exploring, this is what we are looking at this time, because that was very much present in Maya Angelou's autobiography series. We had like different books, like, yes, we are looking at different periods of her life, but also in each book there were also sort of these like themes and topics that she was very much exploring at the same time. And I see a lot of that in this, and that's why I'm really interested to read the other books, because I feel like you'll come away when you've consumed the whole series with this real like knowledge of both personal and wider, you know, like very much bringing home political concepts through showing you like the actual personal lived experience of them. So yeah, I thought that was very well written, very much enjoyed it. Yeah, I thought that was really well written. I continue to want to read more Inuyua Thiong'o works. I think I have another one of his fiction books. I think my partner has one that I can read, so I'm probably going to try and read that in 2023. The final book that I read for nonfiction November prompts was Hidden Hands: The Lives of Manuscripts and Their Makers by Mary Wellesley. I read this for the prompt of secret, because I was going for like secret history, hidden hands behind manuscripts. I loved this so much. This was another 5-star read. It was so amazing. I just don't think until I read this book, like, I fully really thought about how vital manuscripts are for our understanding of the past. I thought that Mary Wellesley framed this in such an interesting manner. Sorry, I'm doing a lot of hand actions. That's when you know I'm really enthusiastic about something. Because she talks about so many different aspects, and she sort of groups it almost thematically. Like, there's a whole chapter where we're looking at specific manuscripts that we almost lost due to some kind of thing, like the big fire that nearly destroyed the Beowulf manuscript and stuff like this. And like, that's a topic that we just explore. We talk about like how we know about some of the makers of the manuscripts. Like, how do we know who made these manuscripts? Like, what are the things that they leave us? And then how do you try and piece together when you're looking at a manuscript? Like, multiple people will have been involved in so many different stages, and that's something that I really learned to appreciate through this, is how many different people, like, you have the person who writes out the most of it, and then you have the person who will sketch in you know, these things, and then you have the colorist, and then you have this, and it's like this massive, it's almost like a comic now, you know, you have so many different, you have like the letterer, you have like the colorist, you have like the line person, like so many different hands involved in one thing, and this thing that takes so long to create, that is really like, to make a manuscript in the medieval era was such an undertaking, and yet people kept on doing it. And why did they keep on doing it? And like, she looks at like the patrons, people who commissioned these manuscripts, like how they were, like, how do you preserve a manuscript, like how do you make a manuscript, anything that you want to know about manuscripts, take a shot every time I say that word, is in this book. But I just felt like it was told with very clearly, like, very, this was a very easy book to read, but it was also utterly fascinating, told with I love it when you can like feel the spark that the person who's written the book has for this. Like, I could feel the spark that Mary Wellesley has, and it really came across to me. And this is another one. It has inserts, if I can open them. So it has inserts to give you images to accompany stuff, and that was really, really great. So as I read each chapter, I would find the images that related to it, because there's nothing like when you're talking about like such a visual medium, like it really is helpful to be able to see what she's talking about. But this was utterly fascinating. I really, truly have come away appreciating the role that manuscripts have in the preservation of history, and also how incredible it is that any of them survived and we have them. Precious little resource that they are. The final book I want to talk about is not one that I read specifically for Nonfiction November. I was already reading it in October and then I finished it in November, so I just thought I'd talk about it now. That's Threads of Life, A History of the World Through the Eye of a Needle by Clare Hunter, where every chapter is sort of focused on a different topic. And I quite enjoy books like that. I feel like it gives you an interesting, like, overarching concept while not having to go like from the start of time onwards. I would say that this book would have massively benefited from what Hidden Hands has, where it has inserts in it, because I kept having to Google things while reading it, which is fine. It's just, I always feel like with books like this, I'm like, why can't you just put some inserts and pictures in? Because you're talking so in depth about certain textiles that it's like, I want to see it, but I also don't want to have to like unlock my phone every 5 minutes and look up another thing. Some of the chapters in this were more interesting to me than others, and I think that's just a nature of a book like this. But when they were interesting, they were like fascinating. I particularly really enjoyed one that was looking at the role of textiles in like rehabilitating soldiers with shell shock after World War One. That kind of just like these little pockets of history that I hadn't really known about before. It was just utterly fascinating, and shining a light on these creators who sometimes all we have of them is this textile that has managed to survive. Sometimes, like the first chapter was about like Mary Queen of Scots and how embroidery was a massive role in her life and was also like something that she sort of used in a political manner to like make political statement, forge political bonds, just stuff like that, which you're like, oh yeah, like I knew the Mary Queen of Scots cat. A little cat that she did that looks really weird, but it had never really occurred to me before, like the role of embroidery as like making political alliances, like creating these things for people that you would like to be allies with and sending them to them, or I understand the concept of using textile and design to impart political messaging. I don't know, it was just interesting and I had a really fun, lovely time. It's not my absolute favorite, just because sometimes it got a little bit as well, like I don't always love it when I'm reading books like this when there's quite a presence of the author's life in them. Sometimes just because I'm like, you're not as interesting, and I don't want that to sound mean. But like sometimes I'm like, I want the history. I don't necessarily need to know that much about you. I don't know. That might be a bit rude, but sometimes that's how it feels. But anyway, that's everything I wanted to talk about for my nonfiction November wrap up. I will be wrapping up my fiction in a different video. I just thought for this month, keep them separate. I would love to know what you read for nonfiction November, how you got on with it. Are there any new faves? Should I have them on my radar? Please do leave a little message to let me know. Otherwise, I hope you're having a lovely day. I'll see you next time for my fiction wrap up.